We continue now at the top of Daf Pezayim and Beis Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 87b. The Mishnah is discussing when a worker is allowed and when he is not allowed to take food that he is working with. And the Mishnah now says when we're talking about food that's attached to the ground, he's not allowed to take b'shah she'ein gemar malach at a time that it's not the gemar malach at a time that it's not the finishing of the work. Rashi explains b'shah she'ein gemar malach at a time it's not the finishing of the work. Kagon hamenachesh bebetzolim, for example, let's say a person is weeding by the onions, that would not be gemar malacha. Uvetolish min akarka. Now let's say he's working with food that is detached from the ground. Me'achar shenigmar malachto. After there is a gemar malacha, when it's completed, that's when he's not allowed to take. Uvedavar shein gidula min haaretz. And also, if it's something that doesn't grow from the ground, there also the worker is not allowed to take that kind of food. And Rashi explains me'achar shenigmar malachto. Again, if it's detached from the ground, so then it's going to be a problem for the worker to take if there was a gemar malacha. Kagon nisparsu agul of demasnis, and that's like the case where the fig cakes broke apart. That comes up later in the Mishnah. Uvedavar shein gidula min haaretz. Also from things that don't grow from the ground, the worker can't take. Kagon hachole behemos of amegabin. For example, if somebody is milking animals or making cheese, there the worker is not allowed to take the food. And the Gemara says, Menohani mili, from where do we know this? Where do we know this idea from the pasuk that the worker takes the food? Techsiv, as it's written, Kisavo bekerem reyachov yachalt. It says the person comes in the vineyard of your friend, so then you can eat. And so you see that when you're working in the vineyard, so you are allowed to take the food. Rashi here explains, Menahani mili de poel ochel b'mechuber. How do we know that a worker eats from that which is attached to the ground? The pasuk says, Kisavo v'yachalta anavim. It says when you come in, then you can eat the grapes. L'kamon darish le'bepoel. As the Gemara is going to continue on, it's going to say we're talking here about a worker specifically. The sefer dekra v'el keli yecholosita. And the end of the pasuk is you can't put it into your vessels. Mashma ela lekelev shel balabayis tite. And that sounds like you can put it into the vessels of the balabayis. The point is alma b'shas kamar meleches. We see that we're talking about the time of the gemar malacha, meaning to say when you're already detaching it, you're harvesting it from the ground. That's specifically the time, the type of work that we're talking about. That's when the worker is allowed to eat the produce. In any case, that's what we're learning it from. Kisava bekerem reyachov yachalta. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon kerem. So we find this by a vineyard. This pasuk is talking about a kerem. Kol mili minol. And how do we know it applies to all kinds of food that are attached to the ground? So the Gemara says, Gamrinan mikerem. We learn it out from a vineyard. Makerem miyucha davar shegidulei karka. Just like a vineyard, we're talking about something which is attached to which grows from the ground. Uvashas kamar malachim. We're talking about at the end of the work when you are actually detaching it from the ground. Poel ochelbo. That's when the worker is allowed to eat it. Afkol davar shegidulei karka b'shas kamar malacha poel ochelbo. So too, anytime something that grows from the ground at the time of the gemar malacha, the worker is allowed to eat from it. And the Gemara continues, well, mala kerem shekain chayev ba'olalos. But what's unique about kerem is there's an obligation of olalos. Olalos if you have incomplete clusters, you have to leave that for the poor. And so maybe that's something unique. And so the Gemara says, well, gamrinan mikama. We can learn it out from standing grain. We have a similar pasuk by standing grain. The Gemara says, kama gufa minolan. Well, where do we have the pasuk by standing grain? Tichsiv, as it's written, kisavo bekamas reyacha v'katafta melilos biyadecha. It says when you come in to the standing grain of your friend, so then with your hands, you can take some, the worker's allowed to eat some for himself. And so the Gemara again says, Mala kama shekein chayeves bechala. But what's unique about standing grain is there's an obligation of chala, just like by the kerem, by the grapes, there's an obligation of olalos. By the carrot, by the kamas reyecha, by the standing grain, there's an obligation of chala. But the Gemara first says, Umimai dehai kama de mischayeves bechala. But how do you know that when it says the word kama, standing grain, that it's talking about the kind of grain that's chayev and chala? Only the 5 grains are going to be chayev and chala. Not all kinds of standing grain are chayev and chala. Dilma kol kama rachmana. Maybe the pasuk is talking about all kinds of standing grain, even though there is no chayev chala. The Gemara says to that, asya kama. That we can learn out from a gzera shava. It uses the word kama over here, and it uses it somewhere else where it's clear it's one of the 5 grains. Ksiv hacha, it's written over here, kisavo bekamas reyacha. It says you come into the standing grain of your friend. Ksiv hasam, and it says over there, mehachel chermesh bakama. It says when you have the sickle to the kama, to the standing grain, and over there in that pasuk, the full pasuk there is talking Shiva Shavuos Tispar Lach Mehachel Chermesh Bakama Tachel Lispor Shiva Shavuos. It's talking about the fact that we have Sfiras HaOmer, we count the 7 weeks. So that's talking specifically about barley over there. Barley is one of the 5 grains, and so therefore we say Mahasam, just like over there, Kama de Mechayva Bechala. We're talking about standing grain that's Chayv and Chala. Avhacha Sotu Avhachanami Sotu over here, Kama de Mechayva Bechala. We're talking about the standing grain which is Chayv and Chala. And so the Gemara resumes its discussion. So then we have a refutation. By standing grain, it's chayiv and challah. Maybe only that kind of food this halacha applies. And so the Gemara says kerem yochiach, but a vineyard proves the other way. But mala kerem shekain chayiv ba'olalos. But what's unique about vineyard is there's a chayiv of olalos. Again, the incomplete clusters that go to the poor. And so kama tochiach. So the standing grain proves the other way. V'chazar adin, it goes back and forth. Lo roizeh karoizeh. This one is not like this one. So we have to find the common denominator. Hatzad hashavish abehen. The common denominator is shekain davar shagidulei karka. Again, these are all things that grow from the ground. Uveshas kamar malacha. And we're talking about the time of the finishing of the work. Poel ochel bo. The worker's allowed to eat it. Af kol davar shagidulei karka b'shas kamar malacha poel ochel bo. So to anything that grows from the ground at the time of the completion of the worker can eat it. But the Gemara still asks, Mala hatzad hashavish abehen. But what common denominator can we find when it comes to kerem and kama? Shekain yeshba and sad mizbeach. Both of those are involved in the mizbeach, meaning to say when it comes to grain, you have karbonos that come from grain. When it comes to wine, you have libations that come from wine. They have something to do with the mizbeach. V'yasanami zayis, and then we can derive from their olives as well. The isbeit sad mizbeach, olives also. By oil can be part of carbon mincha. That also can go on the mizbeach. And so therefore maybe only those kind of things this halacha applies to. And so therefore, but the Gemara first says, V'zayis b'meh hatzad asi. But what do you mean? Do you even need to learn olives from a common denominator? That's not true. Hu gufe kerem ikri. Actually, zayis is also called a kerem. That could be directly from the pasuk. So the Gemara essentially is interrupting and saying, what do you mean you're learning zayis from kerem, from the combination of kerem and kama? Zayis itself is kerem. Where do we see that zayis is kerem? Because there's a pasuk where it's written, Vayivar migodish v'yad kama v'yad kerem zayis. The pasuk uses the term kerem zayis. Clearly, zayis is called a kerem. The Gemara says not necessarily. Amar Rapapa says kerem zayis ikri. It's called a kerem zayis, kerem stomalo ikri. But by zayis, it's not just called kerem. In any case, the Gemara says mikol makom kasha. Nevertheless, we still have our question. Maybe it has to have a tzad mizbeach. And so the Gemara says ella rather. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says it's learned from the following pasuk. Amar Kra. The pasuk says v'chermesh. It talks about the sickle. L'rabos kol baalei chermesh. It comes to include anything which you harvest with a sickle, and therefore it doesn't only have to be foods that have something to do with the mizbeach. It applies to everything, all foods that grow from the ground. But the Gemara says v'hai chermish. But this word chermish, when it talks about the sickle, mi boy le b'shas chermish echol, doesn't that mean to teach us that it's at the time of the sickle that one can eat, meaning at the gemar malacha when you're actually detaching it from the ground? Shelo b'shas chermish lo seichel. And we learn from there that if it's not the time that you're detaching it from the ground, you're not allowed to eat. So the Gemara says no, ahumi ve'el kelyecha lo site, and that's actually learned from ve'el kelyecha. You can't put it into your vessels. It's going into the vessel of the balabayas. That signifies that it's the end of the work, that it's being harvested. That's what we learn from there. That's from Hahumi Vel Kelyachos Site Nafka. That's learned from Vel Kelyachos Site, and so we don't need Chermish for that purpose. But the Gemara still says Teinach Devar Chermish. So even if you're learning all foods from sickle, so that only would apply to foods that are harvested with a sickle. The Lav Bar Chermish Manolan. How do you know about other things which are harvested without a Chermish? How do you know to include those? And so the Gemara says Ella, rather it's a different source. Amar Rav Yitzchak says Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says Kama, it says standing grain. L'rabos kol balei kama. That includes anything that is standing. It includes anything, essentially, all these kinds of food. But the Gemara said, what do you mean? V'amar kama de mechayva b'chala. But you said by kama also there was a limitation, because standing grain could be something that's chayiv in chala. And so the Gemara essentially says it's a combination. Hani mili mekami denesi chermish. That's before we learned from the word chermish. Hashda da'asi chermish. But now that we have the word sickle, it's Rabbi called devar chermish. We include anything that comes with the sickle. V'afagav the lo mechayv b'chala, even though there's no obligation of chala. And now we can say kama lamali. So what do we have the word kama for? L'rabos kol balei kama. It includes anything that's standing, and so therefore anything that's standing would include all foods that grow from the ground. And the Gemara continues, well, v'hashta de nafkalon mechermish u'mikama. But now that we're using the words chermish and kama to say that this applies to all foods, so now we have to go back to the vineyard. Kisavo bekerem reyachol amali. What do we need the pasuk of when you come into the vineyard of your friend? There's nothing, we don't need to learn from vineyard anymore if it applies to all foods. And the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, halchos of that pasuk, those psukim that have to do with kerem, they're teaching specific halachas. Kedetanya, as we learned in the following brayso, kisavo, it says when you come, nemar kan bia v'nemar lahalon lo savo elav hashemesh. It says over here the word bia, that you're coming into the field, but it doesn't identify who's coming into the field. But there's another pasuk that also uses the word bia, lo savo olav hashemesh. That's talking about the worker that you have to pay him on time. And malahalon bepoel hakasa medaber, afkan bepoel hakasa medaber. Just like over there we're talking about a worker, so too here we're talking about a worker. That's how we know that all these psukim in general, when we're talking about eating from the field, we're talking about workers. And the Gemara continues, bekerem re'echo, it says in the vineyard of your friend, v'lo bekerem kusi. This doesn't apply in the vineyard of a kusi. What that means to say is the limitations don't apply by the vineyard of a non-Jew. By a non-Jew, you're allowed to take even without any of these limitations. And Rashi explains, kerem re'acha, in the vineyard of your friend, v'el kel yecholosita, and you can't put it into your vessels. You're allowed to eat it directly, but you can't store it in your vessels. Aval kerem kusi titen, but if it's the vineyard of the non-Jew, then you are allowed to do that. And so the Gemara continues, Hanichulaman Damar Gezel Kusi Aser, that works according to the one who says stealing from a non-Jew in general is Aser. So Hainu Ditzrichrala Mishri Poel. That's why we would need a pasuk to say that by the worker it's okay. Stealing in general from a Kusi is a problem, but by a worker it's okay. Elulaman Damar Gezel Kusi Mutter, but according to the one who says that stealing from a non-Jew is Mutter, so Hashta Gezela Mutter, if stealing is Mutter, Poel Mi Boy, so do we even need a pasuk to say that the worker can take the food from the Kusi? That wouldn't make sense. And so the Gemara says, you're right, according to that man Amar, the pasuk is used for the following: Mukim la bekerem re'acha v'lo shel hektish. We're going to establish this pasuk as meaning the vineyard of your friend, but this halacha does not apply if the vineyard belongs to hektish. And then the pasuk goes on to say v'achalta, you can eat, v'lo motzitz. It means to say you can eat it, but you're not allowed to suck out the juice and then throw aside the rest. That you're not allowed to do. And also it says anovim, it says grapes, v'lo anovim b'davar acher. You can't have the grapes with something else. The point over here is that maybe you'll dip the grapes in order to eat a lot to make it more tasty. That's already going to be a problem. And Rashi explains, "V'lo motzitz hayayin v'zorek hachartzonim." You can't suck out the wine and then throw out all the rest. V'lo anovim v'davar acher, and also you can't have the grapes with something else. The worker's not allowed to litvol anovim b'melach. He's not allowed to dip the grapes in salt. L'miskan sheyochel harbe. In that way, it'll taste better and he'll eat more. That he's not allowed to do. And then the pasuk says, "Kenafshecha." We learn from Kenafshecha, "Kenefesh shel balabayis kach nafshe shel poel." Like the balabayis is the worker. Manafshecha ochelu pater. Just like the balabayis, if he eats it, he's going to be pater in terms of the obligation of meiser. Af nafshe shel poel ochel. So too, when it comes to the worker, he's able to eat it upater, and he's exempt from meiser. And Rashi explains, "Kenafshecha ki'ilu hein shelcha," means it's as if it belongs to you. Manafshecha ochelu pater men meiser. Just like you, if you would eat it in this fashion, you're pater from meiser, the halo nigmar malachto lemeiser, because you don't have the completion of the work in terms of the obligation of meiser. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, yayin mishayered labor. The wine is only obligated in meiser when it goes into the pit. Af poel ochelu pater, so to the worker can eat and he's exempt from meiser. V'lo amrina, we don't say hol deva agre ochel al karcho shel balabayis. Maybe we'll say that since he's eating and this is part of his wages, he's eating against the will of the balabayis. Havale kamekach, maybe that makes it like a purchase. Umekach kovas lemeiser, and if it's a purchase already, that would establish a chi of meiser. Af davar shelo nigmar malachto, even though there was no gemar malacha, kevan dezav neachshave, since he bought it, that made it important that it's obligated in meiser. Maybe you would say that, and that's what we're saying over here in the brisa, that that's not the case. And the Gemara continues. The pasuk says savecha. It says that the worker can eat to his satisfaction, to your satisfaction. V'lo achila gasa, but you can't have an achila gasa. You can't overeat it. V'al keli yecholositin, and then it says don't put it into your vessels. You can eat it, but you can't put it into your vessels. And the point is, b'shashat hanosin lekelev shel balabayis. At the time that you're putting it into the vessels of the balabayis, meaning at the time it's being harvested, that time ata ochel, during that time you can eat. Uv'shashat iyat hanosin lekelev shel balabayis. But if it's not the time of the gemar malacha, when you're putting it into the vessels of the balabayis, iyat ochel, at that point in time you are not allowed to eat. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yanai says, Ein ha-tevel mischai b'meiser. Tevel is not chayiv in meiser. Rashi says, Ein ha-tevel mischai afilu mercho b'kri basada. Even let's say he piled up the grain in the field, it's not going to be chayiv in meiser until, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Peches Amud Aleph.